Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar from Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dault, and I'm a business journalist at Smith. To begin today, I want to acknowledge that Queens is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Shaping Tomorrow, the Purpose Revolution in Business. And today we're going to be learning about how to unlock the secrets of building a purpose-driven business and career. And we have a really fantastic panel lined up. So thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is in fact not presented by our usual presenter. So today's we're going to be telling you about a new center that is formed at Smith School of Business that we're really excited to tell you about. So just stay tuned until the end of the webinar. Before we get started with today's presentation, a couple of housekeeping things. The first is that yes, indeed, today's presentation will be recorded. So our most common question, will the conversation be recorded? Yes, just by being here today, you will automatically get a link to that recording in your inbox. So stay tuned. No, you will not be getting the slides individually, but yes, you will be getting a link to the recording, and feel free to share that with people in your network. The other thing is that we will be taking questions from the audience in the second part of today's session. So I will invite you to use the Q&A button. The chat window is open. I love that you guys are telling us where you're from. It's really wonderful to know that you're from, you're tuning us from all over the place. But if you have questions for the panel, please use the Q&A button only, because I often miss your questions if they're in the chat window. Okay, good. I think we're all good to go. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. So how the format today is we're going to have a presentation from our first speaker, and then we're going to open to the broader panel discussion, and then we're going to your questions. Okay, so work with us. Here we go. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Elspeth Murray, a woman with many titles at Smith School of Business, including Associate Professor, Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Social Impact. That's the new center, and a CIBC Fellow in Entrepreneurship. Dr. Murray has expertise in strategy, the management of change, and entrepreneurship. She is the co-author of the best-selling book, Fast Forward, Organizational Change in 100 Days with Peter Richardson. She also advises a number of tech companies and is working with some of these on digital transformation projects focused on creating an analytics culture. Prior to joining Smith, Dr. Murray worked for several firms, including IBM and Canadian Tire. Welcome, Dr. Murray. I'm going to remove myself from the screen and let you have the floor. So here goes.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And I am going to do something that we all do in webinars like this, and I am going to share my screen. I wish I could see everybody weighing in on the chat from across the country. I have certainly seen a few familiar names, so welcome everyone. I think we're going to have a really great discussion here. Meredith will be introducing our panelists in about 10 minutes. And what I thought I would do is just prime the pump, so to speak, around a couple of things to think about. And as the title says, Shaping Tomorrow, the Purpose Revolution in Business. I've been at Queen's, as some of you know, for a number of years, and I am a strategy professor, and I'm always looking for the latest trends and things that are really going to stick, and what is really impacting the success of organizations and businesses. And over the last little while, I've been really thinking about this thing called purpose, and whether or not it's actually a revolution or another iteration of corporate social responsibility, responsible leadership, or things like that. But we can address that in our Q&A session. So first things first, when we talk about the purpose revolution, what do we mean by that? And organizations that are purpose-driven, generally speaking, do things and think about going beyond profits and shareholder returns, are generally speaking looking to improve lives of people and their communities. They talk a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN, and they carve out, like, what do we want to focus on? They tend to think about doing things that will benefit not just shareholders, but society as a whole. And generally speaking, are committed to changing the world for the better. So I think this is all very interesting, especially at this point in time, in a post-COVID era where we all contemplated, life, the universe, and everything, and what's it all about. And I think it's interesting to contemplate this in the context of what's happening around the world at the moment. Again, what's it all about? And I believe there could be a Burt Bacharach song that has a refrain like that. So like all academics, I've been trying to look for evidence that we're really onto something now. And of course, the popular press is laden with articles about impacts of climate change and social injustice, and the list goes on and on. But I thought we'd get just a bit more granular, even though that is the context. So I've been digging around and have found some surprising data and studies, and that's what I want to share with you as a backdrop to our conversation and our panel discussion. There is no doubt, the evidence is clear, that for employees who work in organizations for which there is a purpose beyond driving profits and financial returns, there is a lot of really good news here. So a reduced risk of stroke, a reduced risk of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, generally speaking, better mental health with a significant reduction in things like anxiety, depression, feeling isolated, better physical health, reduced risk of heart attacks. My doctor tells me inflammation is a really, really bad thing. So guess what? Lower levels of inflammatory response, longer lifespans, more resilient, better able to heal. So there is no question that for someone working in a purpose-driven organization, there is really good news at an individual level. So I thought that's all well and good, but what might the compelling proposition be for businesses? And similarly to the work and research on what's in it for individuals, there's a fair whack body of evidence emerging from many different consulting organizations and other academic papers, really looking at a variety of benefits. So more resilient employees, reduced turnover. And we're not talking just sort of a fraction, at the edges, 6 times more likely for people to stay at an organization. Better retention relative to competitors, all else being equal. One thing that's near and dear to my heart that is so critical in times of great change is this ability to innovate. So how about 30% higher levels of innovation? And then the last 2 bullet points, I think, are incredibly impactful. So Gen Z and millennials, not my generations, will make up the vast majority of the workforce by 2025. And here's the final kicker. Okay, working for an organization with a purpose they believe in is very important to those 2 demographic groups. I was just teaching on another program yesterday, and we had a huge debate about the boomers, who are still, generally speaking, often in charge, and some of these other demographic groups. The evidence is pretty clear that in addition to all of these incredible sort of input factors, that at the end of the day, this is a great book, Firms of Endearment. At the end of the day, there is something in it for financial return, however you might measure that. So again, we're starting to see that this is not a net on top of everything else I would do, and therefore negative financial impact. It's quite the opposite. So again, in the spirit of looking for evidence, as an academic, as I said before, I dig around. So I found this really interesting organization that has created the Purpose Power Index. They've done a couple of big surveys. So with 5,500 respondents. This is US based, looking at a variety of different companies, very current. And here's what they measure. So they measure the degree to which an organization will go beyond profits, the degree to which lives are improving, and there's a focus on that, the degree to which there's a better society as a focus, and a degree to which there's a better world. And I found this fascinating. And I apologize that this is a bit of an eye chart here, but here's the list of companies. And I have circled 2 of them because I've been doing a deep dive into Unilever, which makes a whole variety of products from cosmetics to cleaning products, but also the #1 company on this index, which is called Seventh Generation. And a little known fact is that Unilever actually acquired Seventh Generation a number of years ago, but you can only find that out if you go to the Unilever website, not Seventh Generation, which is a whole other topic in terms of how you leave a great company alone to do what they need to do. So what I wanted to do is just get a little bit more granular, and then we will move to the panel discussion. So as you look at that list, in 2022, what was really new was that automotive as a general industry was kind of moving up, which is interesting to look at these companies listed here and what it is they are doing against those 4 criteria in the index. But let's talk about the company that's #1 on the list, Seventh Generation. And some of you may know that the name of the company is very symbolic. And it really is about thinking 7 generations beyond this moment in time to think about your impact in the world. Now, they started in 1980 as a mail order business, so very interesting origin story. But they were also the first company to create paper towels from, that were unbleached, so on and so forth. So a quick Google search, and you can find out a lot more about these folks. But again, back to, what's in it for mainstream business. Well, there are lots of good things that can happen. Focusing beyond profits. And I would draw your attention to the year 2010, when Unilever created a new strategy called the Sustainable Living Plan. And that was really around going beyond profits. And you can see, we all like to look at these bar charts in the world of business. You can see that things have gone pretty well. You can read some of the statistics about how they have reduced landfills, greenhouse gas emissions, using renewable energy, and reducing costs by over €1 billion by stripping out waste in many of their processes. But what's really interesting to me, and my last point before I stop sharing my screen, is that the vast majority of success in the future, contribution to current success and growth, are around the brands that are purpose driven. And on that note, let me stop sharing my screen, and hopefully this has given everybody on the call some food for thought as we start to ask some questions about our panelists. So Meredith, back over to you.
Thanks, Elspeth. That was great. Do you have a sense of how Unilever describes their own purpose?
You can find it on the website, but this is really about creating a better world and a more sustainable world. And the only other thing that I would add is they go well beyond vision, mission, and purpose. Like, they have huge documents to really describe what it means. But this is about embedding sustainability at the core of everything that they do.
Oh, great. Leslie Robb just added it to the chat.
Awesome. Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Our purpose is to make sustainable living commonplace. It's why we come to work. It's why we're in business. It's how we inspire exceptional performance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping somebody would be on the call. I love it. I'm a Unilever fan for all of the reasons we'll get into.
Amazing. So without further ado, I want to bring Dakota and Pierre into the conversation. So Dakota Lavery is Anishinaabe from Hiawatha First Nation, where he currently works as its financial controller. Dakota was raised on the reservation right up until he came to Queen's University, where he earned a commerce degree at Smith School of Business. And prior to rejoining his home community, he worked as an investment banking analyst, diversified industries at BMO Capital Markets in Toronto. He also serves as a director on the board of Our Children's Medicine, a registered charity targeted at helping Indigenous job seekers achieve entry-level employment. And you can bet we are going to be asking Dakota about that transition from Bay Street back to his home community. So thank you for being here, Dakota. And Pierre Taillefer leads BDO Canada's Sustainability and Environment, Social and Governance practice. He has more than 30 years of in-depth experience, including 7 years as an external auditor and more than 23 years performing sustainability assurance and risk-related advisory engagements. Under the ESG umbrella, Pierre possesses extensive experience in the implementation, optimization, and maintenance of stakeholder-based ESG programs and reporting. Prior to joining BDO, Pierre spent 18 years at a Big Four accounting firm, where he managed a client portfolio of Crown corporations, financial institutions, telecommunications companies, and manufacturing companies. Thanks for being with us, Pierre.
Thanks, Meredith.
So I want to start, so we heard a little bit off the top from Elspeth, so I want to go right to you, Pierre, and bring you into the conversation to ask you, what's your experience with purpose working in the ESG space with your clients the way you do?
I'd say there are varying levels of discussion around purpose. ESG itself as an initiative is, I've been involved in this for about 15 years now. In my previous life at that Big Four, delivering ESG, what was corporate social responsibility services, and looking at helping organizations be more responsible. So not only evaluating the performance of an organization based on shareholder value, but based on stakeholder value. And over the expectation 15 years ago was that this would become the norm in North America, and that we would be equivalent or gain momentum as what in terms of what we see in Europe. And so that still hasn't happened. Europe is still ahead of the game in terms of ESG reporting. Corporate social responsibility became ESG. The sustainability umbrella has always stayed. ESG focuses more on programs, on performance, key performance indicators, and an ability to report. In that context, leading with purpose is important in that it integrates into ESG and what are an organization's objectives in addition to financial performance, and how are they moving towards achieving those objectives. So ESG is a more quantitative approach to corporate responsibility, and one where it is over time implemented to be able to demonstrate how an organization performs. I would say when we get out into the market to talk to organizations or companies about implementing ESG programs, the argument for leading with purpose is less of a priority in general than it is. We are still an economy that is based on financial performance. And over time, that's going to change. To talk to companies, not-for-profits, government about leading with purpose, it's a challenge right now, especially in the context of a potential recession or downturn in the economy. Also, the fact that the US is what I would say lagging as well in terms of implementation of ESG. And so Canada is following closely what's happening in the US.
And why are we so far behind Europe, briefly?
Europe has had for 15, 20 years requirements for publicly traded companies to report on corporate responsibility. And also there's a cap and trade market that has been in place for a number of years in Europe. Canada, US, we do have cap and trade markets, but there are carbon trading markets, but there's no cap and trade system that applies to all organizations and all industries. And there still is no requirement to report on corporate responsibility. That's going to come with ISSB. If those listening today are aware of the International IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, and International Sustainability Standards Board that has come out with 2 standards, one on non-climate and one on climate, which will eventually be implemented, first touch publicly traded companies, and then will touch to private companies, but for an integrated audit of financial and non-financial information. That's going to change the context in terms of reporting. So just back to leading with purpose, it is not a reason that I see for most organizations to move in terms of ESG, although they understand that it's very important to their people.
Okay, that's great. That's really helpful context. Thanks for that. And Dakota, I just want to make sure that we get your voice in. How does the idea for you of purpose resonate with your experience? I know you're in a different place in your career than some of our other panelists. Tell us about your experience.
So yeah, I took a very large pivot in my career, and I'd say in large part that is due to purpose. So I went, as you mentioned, from Bay Street and working in investment banking, and now I'm working for my First Nation, which is quite the culture shock. But a lot of it has to do with that very point is purpose. And purpose comes in many different ways. I often approach things from an Indigenous lens on that. And we start just kind of at the level of the individual. And so that decision for me, it was kind of, it was at a time in my life where I was learning a lot from working in investment banking and getting a lot of technical skills. But I also knew that my community needed me and needed those skills to be applied there. And then from a personal basis, I was also going through some family stuff as well. My mother had passed at the time, and so I was in need of a change. And so at the time, I was faced with a decision whether to go into a different career, still in finance in Bay Street, perhaps in equity research or something along those lines, or make a full pivot right out to our community. And I think just in the support that I was needing around that time, individually, I felt it right to go to the community. Kind of the next ring that goes around that is family. So I've spoken to the piece on a personal level, but also in Indigenous communities, we are quite small. Many of the people on the reserve, we often say we have 3 large families and everybody's related one way or another. And so the people I serve in my role here with the community and finance is basically directly related to myself. And so that is a great sense of purpose in everything I do. I'm always thinking about those people. Beyond the family, then you start to think at the community level. For my community at the time, what made this role really opportune was that, a few years ago, our community was fortunate to receive some settlement monies from the government of Canada and Ontario for the Williams Treaty, treaties that were signed in 1923. And so we, historically have had to manage poverty in our community, and we finally were at this place of managing wealth, but we've never had anyone with a financial lens in our community. And so they did a call out for the position I'm in, the finance comptroller, but they weren't successful in finding anyone. And I didn't find it right at the time they originally did that call out. Later, when I saw the more personal reason to make the transition, I revisited that with them. I said, were you ever successful in that? And they said, no, but we certainly still need someone just to oversee those monies. And whether it be from an investment perspective, an economic development perspective, capital projects and budget management, the community really needed someone to oversee the finances that way. And so there was a great opportunity there. And then beyond that ring of the community, then you start to think at the nation level. And from a perspective of purpose, I think there is a lot of shared purpose amongst Indigenous people. We find that we share a lot of the same challenges in our histories, with the tumultuous relationships with the various governments. And so in navigating that, I think we all find that we share a lot in that. There's other ways too that we find purpose. Every day when I come to work, I'm thinking about the 2-legged, the 4-legged, the ones in the sea, the ones in the sky world. That is the Indigenous approach to things. I'm thinking about those 7 generations, just as was mentioned earlier, the 7 generations that preceded us, but also those 7 generations to come. And myself as a youth, I have a great perspective on that as being relatively young. I think just about those children and those the potential there that those in those generations. And so there's a variety of ways I find purpose and exhibit purpose, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to service and servicing, your community and servicing your people.
That's really great. Thanks for that intro, Dakota. I do actually want to quickly get you to touch on is there a worldview where purpose is kind of woven into the business model that you're operating within?
Yes, absolutely. Purpose kind of flows into everything. At the end of the day, all the work we do here in our administration of our nation is about serving the people. And that can be seen right down to the level of our businesses. You know, when we operate a gas station, we have one here on the reservation. It's not about just pulling in as much profit as we can. We're thinking about all the, you know, the social factors. I would say it's much more of a social enterprise than a for-profit commercial enterprise, because it's about the employment opportunities that it offers for people, the education and the training. It does bring in, you know, sales and profits for the community, which are great. But we actually, the priorities we set for it is, number one is employment, which, you know, often it works against profitability. So employment first, second is sales, and only third is profit, because I would rather sell more products and create more opportunities for people to utilize things and bring, you know, resources into our community, rather than just increase the margins on our business. And ultimately we would just be extracting greater profits from our own citizens. So
Right.
yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks for that. So I want to jump right into this. So Pierre, you were talking about how, you know, 15 years ago, we were talking about this. We've seen a decline. We've also, Elspeth, in the past, you've talked about this being, you know, a revolution, but sort of we're questioning, like, is this really a revolution? As we've all said, we've seen some of this before. We have been talking about this. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the late 1980s, where we all just decided the environment was important. And you saw companies like Loblaw starting to make sort of inroads in that area. Is something different this time around? Do you think we're going to make things stick this time around? Elspeth, I see you. Want to get in?
I'm always the optimist, and I have to say, Pierre, you know, when you were chatting, I was like, geez, like, it's so depressing to think that once again.
But it's not. And I'll let you answer, and then I'll give my point of view.
I know. So I actually see more organizations starting to flirt with discussions around purpose, because as you look around at the successes of the Unilevers of the world, like, it's just hard to argue against that. They've proven that it's not either or. And I guess that's what really ticks me off, is that in some companies, and this is a depressing stuff, it's like, oh, that's going to cost us more. And it's like, no, it's not. So I would say, if I was a betting person, I would say that we're really onto something, because it's sort of like the perfect storm. Something's got to give. And I think even in a recessionary environment, you know, where people might just, and Pierre, I know you're, but I would say that, yeah, I know you're just waiting, but I would say, yeah, you're going to hire people, or people are going to work for you because they have no other choice. They're not going to be great employees. Like, you are not going to be successful and outpace your competitors. So my last comment here is, I think what really works against putting pedal to the metal with respect to purpose is this incredible short-termism that we have in North America, driven by the financial markets. And I have comments on that later, but I will stop now. And Pierre, I will throw it over to you.
I'd like us to continue this conversation. Actually, so Meredith, to answer your question, I think this is going to stick. And yes, the trend is not, we are not Europe, but the trend is completely different from what it was 15 years ago. So there are still some challenges in getting in front of clients and explaining why this is to be done. And when I do, I don't talk about regulation. I talk about value creation. And that, Elspeth, it covers a number of different pieces, including purpose, because it's with regard to your employees. It is with regard to being more competitive. And actually, you're right, they're not mutually exclusive. Being responsible can also allow you to be more profitable. And so it's an investment. And that's what it's not a cost. We talk about it being an investment that is a short-term additional cost in quotation marks, but that over time will help with financial performance, will help you keep your employees. Losing an employee and rehiring costs a fortune for an organization. So to be responsible and be able to retain is very important. Having that broader view is a challenge with some organizations. And even yesterday, I was having the conversation with an organization in the construction industry and that person was saying, I don't get it. I don't get why there are challenges to this in the market, to integrating ESG into how you operate, because it just makes business sense. So this is going to stick. And a number of different things, including Canada's commitment to net zero, including the integrated audit standards on ISSB. There have never been so many pieces together that are going to push to this sticking.
So what does the actual transition look like for a company that maybe hasn't been thinking about this and now they're thinking, okay, well, this makes business sense. What the heck? What do I do? Where do I start?
So ultimately right now, there is no one framework that needs to be complied with. There is no one answer to ESG. It's based on your stakeholders. So instead of looking at shareholders, it's your stakeholders, and they are internal and external. And what do they want to see from you? Shareholders are an important stakeholder. They want profit, but they're not the only stakeholder in an organization. So we help, we start with, what do you currently do that could be categorized under E, S, and G? And then we reach out, stakeholder engagement. We talk to those stakeholders. We do surveys. We get an understanding of what they want to see from an ESG program. That's called a materiality assessment. So taking that information, what the company or entity, because it's not just companies that are for profit, but what they currently do versus what their stakeholders want to see. And we help develop an action plan on how to implement over time. Right now, again, there's no regulatory. There actually is. There are certain requirements for large financial institutions to disclose greenhouse gas emissions next year. They're in the environmental space, depending on your industry. There's regulation. Overall, though, there is no requirement for ESG. So for me, this is a business transformation. For me, in 20 years, we're not going to talk about ESG. This is how we're going to operate our organizations, starting to think about it now, integrating it into how you deliver your services just makes business sense. So it's really, where are you now? What do your stakeholders want? And let's develop an action plan to get there.
Right. Dakota, how does this align with the way you're thinking about running your businesses?
So ironically, I'd say that the characterization of saying it is a revolution comes as somewhat of a surprise to me in the sense that, this is how Indigenous people have always operated, and we've been here since time immemorial. But I can certainly relate, in my experience. We live in a capitalistic society. I've worked on Bay Street. I've went through a commerce program that all operates under that capitalistic framework. I know what that's like. And in coming back to the community, there's a difference there. But I don't think this is revolutionary. Clearly, it works if Indigenous people have been here and survived this long. And I think it's a good model to go with. With that being said, I think some of the challenges that organizations are going to face is, I think the ones that are going to be most in the light are companies that are on the publicly traded stock markets and things like that, because they're going to be front and center accountable to these metrics. And frankly, they're going to have competing priorities, as they're going to have the shareholders who are going to be looking strictly at that financial reporting piece and looking at the profitability metrics, and they're going to be pretty short-sighted in that and focused on the short term and delivering that to the value to shareholders, while also balancing that with the long-term stakeholders and things like that. And so I think how organizations should start to approach this is, you need to start small. Is you have to build that company culture. You have to build a sense of trust and relationships amongst your people, and then you broaden that out. And it comes back to purpose. You have to build a sense of purpose amongst your employees and that the communities and the stakeholders that they serve.
So I want to get to that, because it's all well and good for companies to say, okay, well, this is our purpose. go ahead, employees, embrace it. I mean, how do you actually get them to embrace the purpose? And especially, and Elspeth, you talked about having had this debate in one of your workshops between the boomers and the younger generations who have different ideas about what it means to be an employee and to work for a company. There's a lot in there, I realize, but so how do we sort of bridge the generational divide? How do we actually get our employees on board, given that they are all spanning different generations? Who wants to run with this one? Elspeth?
Sure. I mean, I think it's just interesting, Meredith, even the way you sort of phrased the question, like, where does purpose come from? And how do you determine what might be important? So do you do that in the C-suite and say, voila, here's our purpose? Or do you, back to Pierre's comment, I mean, do you derive that because you're tapping into all the stakeholders who matter in your business and you have that more bottom-up approach? So I think you have to embed that. People actually have to believe in it. I would say this may be provocative because it seems like purpose-driven is a good idea. People will slap that into a mission statement or a purpose statement and say, okay, I'm going to make it look good. If I was cynical, Pierre, I would say it's going to help on the ESG reporting, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look, when you lift the hood, you don't see anything else there. So Meredith, to kind of answer your question, I think the way in which you figure out what purpose might matter is not a one and done type exercise, but I think you should not even proceed on that front unless you're willing to actually do the work required to embed it in the organization. And maybe one other thing, and then I'll let Dakota and Pierre weigh in. I think ESG reporting is a good way to dip your toes into all of this. And it's almost a way of just starting to actually warm up for how you might actually embed and be fundamentally more purpose-driven. But okay. Pierre, Dakota, over to you.
Go ahead, Dakota.
Yeah, I've kind of touched on it. I think that you really got to start from that employee level. But I guess even before that, you could take a step back and say that any organization, starts with an idea, and that founder that has some sort of vision of what that will become. And so, that's probably where things start from. But organizations should be versatile and they should adapt and change as circumstances change. There's going to be new information that come up, new issues that arise. And as you are bringing more and more employees into the organization, you're going to have to take them into account. You're going to have to hear their voices. You'll have to validate their concerns and kind of steer your company from there. So I think you start with an idea, obviously, but you've got to be flexible to that. And you constantly got to be communicating that back and bringing people back into that idea. I think when you're starting an organization, some of those first few hires are going to be key anyway, for the purpose that as you are making hires, you're bringing in people that are going to be working towards those same goals. And so I think there's naturally going to be some sort of alignment in values and in purpose of exactly what you should be working towards. And I think where you're going to find that most common is from young people. There's the younger generation is quite socially conscious. And so in most organizations today, any of them that are at scale, there's certainly young people in there that already, have different values or are bringing new considerations to the table. And you just need to ensure that those voices are heard and then be ready to adapt. I'll bring it back to the First Nation perspective of kind of our systems of governance here. I think one of the challenges most organizations will find is in a capitalistic hierarchical society, you have one kind of key person at the top, a figurehead of an organization, the chief executive officer, who is both the spokesperson and the decision maker for the organization that they work for. And I think that's challenging because it puts a lot of pressure on them to make sure that they, in the decisions that they're making, are reflecting the voices of the people. The traditional ways of clan-based governance or First Nations is there was a separation between those duties. The person, speaking on behalf of the nation, historically the chief or a hereditary chief, wasn't usually the person actually driving those decisions. understandably, we were working with smaller communities, but it was the voice of the community. We're consistently trying to build consensus. And that doesn't mean everybody agrees, but at the very least, we understand in any decision being made, we all have to understand the decision before it is moved forward with. And then it is one person who communicates it and one person who's, moderating to make that final decision. And so I think you'll find in a lot of my comments, it's kind of almost going to have to be a fundamental switch in the way we operate companies. We'll have to flatten them a little bit, move away from hierarchical structures, and ensure that the voices of both our, the communities that we serve and our employees are heard. It can't just be one person sitting in an ivory tower calling shots.
We're getting some applause in the
so
chat,
cool.
so thank you.
Yeah.
But Pierre, how realistic, in your experience, you've worked with a lot of different companies. How realistic is this idea of bringing purpose in that Dakota is proposing that's working in his community?
It's going to take time.
Right.
So it's not that it can't be done. Just to go back to Elspeth, your comment on short-term versus long-term. And North America, it's all about short-term. And it's still a model where, said it before, it's profit, and it is profit now. And every action that you take now is very short-term oriented versus Europe. Different mentality, different way of working, and a different view of the importance of people. They have a double materiality. What's the impact of your organization on outside, and so it's a different way of thinking versus North America. So I think it's important that the board be support ESG. I do agree with Elspeth as well that ESG reporting, but it doesn't have to be a report. For me, it could be on the website. Often I get a challenge as well when I talk to clients or potential clients. We don't want an ESG report. It's too much time. You don't have to have one. But thinking about ESG, reporting on your website of what you're doing under ES&G, that is a valid approach to integrating ESG into what you do. I think support needs to come from the board. I'm not certain we're going to get away from the model of having a CEO and a leadership team. We have seen in Europe that you can have purpose and you have that same structure, but it's a different way that individuals are, we just talked about it, are evaluated, are compensated. And again, it's the shift. And this is where it takes time because it's a transformation from short-term to a long-term way of thinking.
Yeah, right. And maybe sorry, Meredith, if I could just add on to that. So, and again, I think it's almost like the adoption of innovation curve, right? You talk about the Unilevers of the world and they're like way out at the forefront. And others will just kind of catch up over time. But I think the CEO at Unilever at the time, Pullman, who did the Sustainable Living Plan, I believe he started a group actually in the United States looking at the problem with the short-termism and the markets driving quarterly returns and all of that reporting. And I also believe that at Unilever, he was very clear on changing the reporting or managing the expectations of the market while they invested in the short term for payoff in the longer term. So I think it is possible, but it requires, I think, extraordinary leadership to be at the leading, edge of that curve. And I will leave us with one other thought about how challenging this problem is. There was a survey of CFOs basically saying, when the quarterly call comes up, what would you sacrifice? And I think it was like 80% of them said, I would definitely sacrifice investments in the long term so that I could meet the market expectations quarter by quarter. And therein lies a fundamental problem with really seeing the revolution here, but it can be done.
Can be done. Okay, we've got to give these people some optimism as they go out into their worlds. We've got 20 minutes left. And in fact, my next question is a bit challenging to that optimism, because how do we make sure that companies aren't just paying lip service to this? How do we ensure that when they say, yeah, this is our purpose, that they really are it really is their purpose. It's not just a marketing ploy. It's not just something they're doing to get more clicks or to sell more yogurt or whatever. Anyone? Pierre.
Oh,
Dakota.
Well, go
I
ahead,
can
Dakota.
jump back to our 7 grandfather teachings. That's the way I guide myself in life. But 2 of those are truth and honesty, and I think both of those are important. People often ask what's the difference between those two. Truth is about the facts that are available and data, I guess, that is out there, and honesty is more about how you communicate that. And I think both of those are going to be important in instilling purpose within any company. Is truth. You saw the presentation earlier. You saw the data that's there, that companies who participate in instilling purpose and ESG and all these things, they are more successful. The honesty that needs to come with that, in use of the term of lip service, is you need to be genuine. You need to fully buy into the words that you're speaking, and you need to speak in a good way, is I guess how I'd put that.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Accountants are going to change the world. And so I am an accountant, by the way. I'm a CPA. Dakota, I 100% agree with you. Having said that, there are a lot of other pressures that need to be taken into consideration in an organization, pushing towards being profitable again, and that short-term view. So the fact that ISSB has has issued audit standards, actually it's accounting standards for ESG. There are also audit standards that are being developed. They're going to start with publicly traded companies. We don't know when that's going to be effective in Canada, but that's also one of the objectives, is to standardize ESG reporting and to provide a level of assurance to the public that what is being reported on is accurate. Talking about greenwashing, some greenwashing can be intentional, other greenwashing can be errors or lack of process around information that is disclosed, which means lack of quality. So the way around that is accountants and an audit of that information, which provides independent assurance, just like the model works with audit of financial statements.
Okay, that's helpful context. Dakota?
If I may jump in, I'll jump back and say, I think I understand where you're coming from. I won't say that I disagree, but I would say we probably come from different perspectives on this, for the reason that it's what I would take is coming down with the accounting standards or anything like that, disclosure standards. It's a very heavy-handed approach to doing things, and it's certainly it's like I said, it's a valid way to approach it. But it would, the Indigenous way would be to consult people and garner that buy-in first. And there's merits and reservations you might have with both. But the reservation I maybe just point out in kind of that approach is that the symptom we see in today's society is there is, growing pushback, I would say, on some of these things. A term such as social justice is often thrown out there. And I worry that if you don't have the correct buy-in before instituting regulations and things like that, then you're going to get pushback. And you can see that in society. We're becoming, increasingly polarized. And part of it has to do with, news. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there. And especially with things at our fingertips on our phones, we're constantly getting pushed media. That certainly doesn't help. But if in any event, if you take heavy-handed approaches to any of these things, I think you're going to get more and more pushback if you go too far too fast. That's the term I always use for this kind of thing. So it's a valid approach. It just might be a different philosophical one than the one I might have chose to take.
And I would add
Elspeth,
one more thing. Yeah, I'm just so I think consumers are going to change the world. I think people who buy stuff, who spend money, who engage in services, if you're really motivated, you can find out if a company is legit. A quick Google search or Bing or whatever you want to use, 5 minutes, if you're highly motivated, you can make a decision about a company that you want to use your cash with, whether or not that's consistent with your values and beliefs. And so it may not have been that important to the boomers. And if all of those surveys and the Gen Zs and the millennials are actually, even if we discount some of that by 50%, it's still a fair whack. So I think people are going to vote with their cash, and you can find out who's authentic and who's not. And maybe that's part of the push, in addition to accountants helping to change the world.
All right, I'm mindful of time, and I want to get to some of our audience questions. An important one from Monique Benoit, who asks, how do you mitigate or manage employee burnout when people are ailing or aligning and therefore investing themselves so personally in a purpose-driven workplace? Have any of you had to deal with that? The purpose driving an employee. So, because if we tell people this is our purpose, and people are coming to work because of purpose, they've now got no separation between work and life. Any thoughts?
I'll jump in on that one. I think we often deal with that in a First Nation setting, especially because you live where you work and you're working for your family. And so the symptom of that is probably a lot of people feel compassion fatigue, is that you care so much about the work you do, and that when you screw up, then you really take that kind of almost, it's hard to make that separation. You take it personally. So I think this is actually probably the flip side of trying to get full buy-in from everyone, is like, if you take that philosophical approach, you're going to risk everyone being so invested and have this burnout. I won't claim to be an expert on how to address that. I recognize that it is an issue, but I guess the generic response I could give is it's about developing a good set of boundaries. I'll take our chief, for example. Our chief lives here right in the community, and she's accountable to over 1,000 citizens who, for most purposes, even have her cell phone. And so she can't, just like a CEO can't be picking up the phone every time a shareholder has an issue, the chief of the community can't just every time there's a personal issue be responding to text. So I think it's about good boundary setting, and that will hopefully help you manage some of that compassion or fatigue from burnout.
That's great. Thank you very much for that.
And I might just add one. I think the downside of unbridled passion, for a greater purpose, is sometimes that you develop unrealistic expectations. As we have been discussing on this call, we're not in Europe. There are great signs that this is all going to work out. So in some cases, it's just taking a step back and saying, I can't change everything overnight all at once. But, where are the leading indicators that it will work out? And so let me track those, but let me set, and Dakota, as you said, in addition to some boundaries, just some more realistic expectations about how long, unfortunately, this might take, but that it will happen.
That's helpful. Thank you. And in fact, with that, on that thread, we've got a question from Ro Sung, which is, thanks for covering this important topic. Are there materials available for creating standard ESG policies for organizations, or sort of like a guideline? Like, Elspeth, would you be able to point people towards getting this information in order to
I'm going to point them towards Pierre, because this is
them to Pierre.
Yes.
Pierre,
and
where you can point
there
people.
There are lots of organizations that are, this is what they do.
So that is what we do, and there would be a lot of documentation available in Google on how to implement an ESG program, and I'm sure that there will be a methodology is fairly standard. How you actually apply that methodology is where all the differences and the experience of somebody would come into play. So I think there's a way that you can do it on your own, and then eventually go and get some assistance if there are gaps in the capabilities that you have as an organization. You'll be able to find documents, templates on the internet for certain.
Okay, that's helpful. And similarly, Brooke Halling writes, what are your thoughts on how to approach metrics and reporting? Should it be reported separately or within other performance metric reporting? Asking for a small organization in the early phases of our ESG action plan.
So my view on that would be that, again, you don't need a separate report. You can report on your website. What we're seeing in the market, where organizations do report on ESG and financial reporting or financial statements, they remain separate reports, where there is, for the most part, a separate ESG report or even a separate climate report. And so how that can be communicated, I would say, if you don't want to invest in preparing a report, is on your website.
Okay.
So I might just add something slightly different. If you're really serious about this, it's not a separate set of reports. It becomes just like back to our shared example of Unilever, where you're tracking the percentage of growth that comes from purpose-driven brands. That's at the core of everything. It's not a bolt-on, it's not an add-on. I think one thing for organizations to consider is, how do you embed it in that more mainstream set of indicators that you're tracking that let you know whether or not you're successful. ESG reporting, I think, is a good start, but that's really, the ultimate goal here is that it is, and Pierre, you said this, it's just business.
Right.
And let's hope that we reach that sooner rather than later. And I think we will.
Well, so let me bring in this question from David McConomy, which is, aren't you saying that a company has to make a decision that they're willing to appeal to investors or shareholders in brackets who are interested in a purpose-driven company, and perhaps suffer some reduction in share price to expand the interests of all stakeholders?
Maybe only in the short term.
And maybe
to reap the benefit, and maybe not. But I think when we looked at that Unilever example, there was a short-term blip, but tremendous outperformance, not even over the long term, over the medium term. But I think, David, this depends on whether you are flipping stocks and you're in and out, or you're thinking of a different investment strategy. But this goes back to voting with your cash as well, in my opinion.
And what I would say is it depends on how fast you want to get there. Yep. So this is a journey we often refer to as the ESG journey. I don't think you need to sacrifice profit to start thinking about ESG and integrate it into how you operate.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm mindful of the time. We did promise our audience some insights as well about moving into purpose-driven careers. And we heard a little bit from Dakota and Pierre. I'm wondering if you very briefly could tell us, you made a switch from working for Big Four accounting firms to working in this more purpose-driven environment. Can you ever so slightly sort of give us a sense of how you made that transition?
For me, my decision was principally, so I was in a Big Four. BDO is still a big firm, but a much smaller approach to managing the business. And so for me, it was a decision to go into an organization that was less mature, but where the professional experience that I was going to gain was very, when I joined the group here, I'm in Montreal, when I joined this group, I was the risk group. And so from that have built a team, and I've also taken on national responsibilities. And so it was much more in personal, my interest in what I wanted to do, what professional challenge I wanted, and BDO was a great place for me to live that. And so purposeful, a more collaborative, I would say, and a more integrated way of working. And so for me, a completely different environment, and one where.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Elspeth, do you have any insights for anyone on the call who might be interested in that, seeking out a more purpose-driven career?
Well, I think you start looking at industries and companies and doing some research on, who's on that adoption curve, who's there, and start to target those folks. I mean, I work in a purpose-driven institution called a university. So every day, I get to change lives through the work that I do. So I'm obviously biased, but I think, that's the kind of company to look for, and you can find it online.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we've got a couple minutes till the end of the hour. I want to leave people feeling kind of hopeful with maybe one takeaway that you can send them off with. Dakota, do you want to start?
Sure. What I would say is to not get too focused on the metrics and things like that. Whether it be even in your career, none of this change has to happen overnight. If you're feeling like you want to pursue something more purposeful, we navigate that in a First Nation community for all the time. For a long time, many people couldn't afford to work for their community because we didn't have the resources to pay them a fair wage. And so, you know, it'd be very fair for some of our citizens to have chose to pursue a corporate career to get the skills or to get the resources they need to make a living and to live. And then later on, either move back to the community or participate in some sort of volunteer work, get engaged in another way. There's no harm in pursuing both. And I think just as an extension of that, if you also get too focused on getting metrics and performance at a company level, you know, that's where you start to run into risks of you know, like an Enron or a Wells Fargo or something like that. They're so intent on hitting their mission and goals and things like that they compromise the whole process of getting there. And so I would leave you with the kind of the sage advice of the Manobo Modzowin is what we often use in Ojibwe, which means to live the good life, to enjoy and to be present and to walk in a good way. I think that is the method that you should employ as you're going through any of this, is just to enjoy the day-to-day. Don't stress on the metrics or the process and things like that, and let the change happen. Let it happen naturally.
That's a great message. Thanks, Dakota. Pierre, any final like half a minute of thought?
There's been tremendous progress over the last 15 years in North America. Even though we talk about it's still a challenge, it is not at all the same world it was 15 years ago. And I think COVID as well had a significant impact on people, and we are going in the right direction.
Okay, that's really helpful. And Elspeth?
My 10 seconds,
you're down to 10.
People create possibilities and prosperity. Do something, do one thing, support one B Corp, go and work for, just do one thing. It's the power of the crowd. It has always been, and I am very optimistic.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Okay, that's really great. Thank you all. Just before I let you all go, Elspeth, I'm gonna let you have the floor, because usually at the end of our webinars, I let people know about some of the programming we have coming up through Queen's Executive Education. Today, I do want to let you have, we're like 30 seconds to tell us about the newly launched Center for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Social Impact at Smith.
Okay. This is going to be super quick. We've put together 2 existing centers, because let's face it, entrepreneurship, innovation, and social impact are all kind of together in this giant Venn diagram. We do 4 things at the center. We inform, we inspire, we educate, and we enable across all of these different buckets that have so much in common at the moment. And at the end of the day, we like to think that we focus on one person at a time, because people create possibilities and prosperity, and that's what we do.
That's great. So everyone, keep your eyes out for information about the new center. You can visit smithqueens.com/ and you'll hear this term, CC, CEISI. When people talk about CC, they're talking about the Center for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Social Impact, and lots of amazing programming is going to be coming out of that center in the weeks, months, and years to come. Finally, I do want to let you know we've got 2 webinars coming up in November. I hope you'll be able to join us for those. The first is coming up on November 1st, Managing and Auditing Whistleblowing Systems, Understanding Best Practices in Whistleblowing, What to Know About Investigations, and How to Enable Employees to Speak Up. So that will be an important webinar, which I hope you'll be able to attend November 1st. 2 weeks later, we'll be delving into how to make your life better with a workshop called How to Reclaim Your Time and Upgrade Your Work Habits. So that is happening on November 16th. I hope you'll join us for both of those. You will be getting information in your inboxes very soon about both of those. So in closing, I just want to thank our fantastic panel, Dakota, Elspeth, Pierre. You've been really wonderful. I know the audience benefited a lot from your insights and really enjoyed the discussion. Apologies to the audience if we weren't able to get to your questions, but thank you so much for your engagement. So once again, thanks everybody, and I hope you enjoy the afternoon and have a great day. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.